December 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The snow fell sideways across the empty prairie, and inside a half-circle metal hut, a German engineer named Klaus Wiener stood frozen, staring at the curved tin walls around him. He'd spent 15 years designing elegant bridges and complex buildings back in Stuttgart, monuments to German precision and superiority. But when the Kansas storm hit with 70-mile-per-hour winds, his beautiful barracks, the one with perfect joints and calculated trusses, collapsed like a house of cards. While this ugly, curved shed, this Quonset hut he'd mocked as a tin can for animals, stood untouched. 8 unskilled men could build it in one day. It cost 1/10 of traditional construction. And Klaus realized with sickening clarity, this wasn't inferior engineering. It was engineering he could never conceive of, because it wasn't designed to prove brilliance. It was designed to save lives. But before we begin, if you want more incredible untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these hidden histories travel. The train lurched to a stop with a metallic shriek that cut through the howling wind, and Klaus Werner felt the jolt travel through his spine like a warning. He pressed his palm against the frosted window, trying to see through the white curtain of snow that engulfed the Kansas prairie. But there was nothing, just endless white, as if the world had been erased. Around him, other prisoners of war shifted in their seats, their Afrika Korps uniforms threadbare and faded, medals long since confiscated, faces hollowed by months of uncertainty. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered a prayer in Bavarian dialect. Klaus reached into his coat pocket and felt the letter there, the paper soft from constant folding and unfolding, his wife's handwriting still legible despite the creases. She'd written it 3 weeks before the Dresden bombing, 3 weeks before the city became ash, 3 weeks before she and their 2 daughters vanished into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. The guards opened the doors and Arctic air rushed in, stealing breath and burning lungs. Klaus stepped down onto the platform, snow immediately soaking through his worn boots, and found himself staring at what could only be described as organized chaos. Camp Concordia stretched before him like a child's sketch of a military installation, rows of curved metal structures that looked less like buildings and more like enormous tin cans, sliced lengthwise and pressed into the frozen earth. Wooden frames jutted up from incomplete foundations. Prisoners in work details moved lumber through the snow, while American guards shouted instructions that were half lost to the wind. Everything looked temporary, unfinished, as if the camp itself wasn't sure it wanted to be there. An American lieutenant approached with a clipboard, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He read names from a list, assigning prisoners to barracks and work details with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times before. When he reached Klaus's name, he paused, glanced up, then made a notation. "You're the engineer," he said in English. Klaus understood enough to nod. The lieutenant gestured toward a Quonset hut converted into an administrative building. "Someone wants to talk to you." Inside, the warmth was shocking, almost painful. A small wood stove glowed in the corner, and behind a desk sat a woman in an American uniform, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression professionally neutral. But when she spoke, it was in flawless German, her accent carrying the soft edges of Bavaria. "Hauptmann Werner," she said, using his former rank, with neither mockery nor reverence, just simple acknowledgement. "I'm Lieutenant Eleanor Hartley. I coordinate Red Cross communications and work assignments. I understand you are a civil engineer in Stuttgart." Klaus felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw. It had been months since anyone had spoken to him in his own language without contempt or pity. Months since anyone had acknowledged his profession as something more than a useless credential from a defeated nation. "Yes," he managed, "bridges primarily, municipal buildings, some residential projects." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her about the suspension bridge over the Neckar that had been his masterwork, about the calculations that had kept him awake for weeks, about the moment when the final keystone was set and the entire structure sang with perfect tension. but the words stuck in his throat because none of it mattered now. His bridges were likely rubble. His city was ash. His family was missing. Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The camp is expanding," she explained. "We need additional barracks, workshops, storage facilities. The commander believes skilled labor from among the prisoners could accelerate construction and provide meaningful work." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "If you're willing to help, I can prioritize your Red Cross family search requests. We have better resources than most realize." Klaus's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, to the letter he couldn't read anymore without memorizing every loop of his wife's handwriting. "What would you need?" "Designs, plans, your expertise." Eleanor slid a folder across the desk. "These are the current specifications. Review them. Tell us how to improve them." The door opened before Klaus could respond, and a young American corporal entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. He was stocky and broad-shouldered, with an easy manner that seemed almost careless, as if the war were an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. "Lieutenant Hartley," he said, then noticed Klaus and switched to broken. "German?" "Ah, the new guy, Tommy Ricci. I run work details." He extended his hand with the casual presumption of American informality. Klaus shook it briefly, noting the calluses of a manual laborer, the confident grip of someone who worked with his hands. Not an engineer, not an architect, a builder perhaps, a carpenter, someone who followed plans rather than created them. "Klaus Werner," he replied in halting English, wanting to establish from the start that he wouldn't rely on translation, that he could meet these Americans on their own linguistic ground even if imperfectly. Tommy grinned. "Your English is better than my German, pal. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be staying." He led Klaus back into the brutal cold, across packed snow paths between the curved metal structures. Other prisoners watched from doorways, their eyes following the new arrival with the mixture of curiosity and apathy that comes from months of captivity. Tommy gestured toward one of the Quonset huts. "Home, sweet home. You'll bunk with about 40 other guys. Not fancy, but it's warm and dry." Klaus stopped at the entrance, staring at the corrugated metal arch, the primitive simplicity of the design. He'd seen these structures from the train window and assumed they were temporary storage, not actual housing for human beings. The curve was mathematically interesting. A catenary arch, naturally strong, but the execution was barbaric. No insulation visible. No architectural detail, no consideration for dignity or comfort, just function reduced to its most basic form. "This is what you build?" The words came out harsher than Klaus intended. "Curved tin cans, like shelters for animals?" Tommy's easy manner evaporated, his jaw tightened and his eyes went flat. "These huts house 3,000 men," he said quietly, each word carefully measured. "Your people are warm, dry, and alive. Maybe think about that before you criticize American hospitality." The morning after Klaus submitted his barracks designs, Lieutenant Colonel Moreland called both him and Tommy into his office. The commander was a lean man with gray at his temples and the kind of stillness that came from having already survived one world war. He spread Klaus's drawings across his desk, detailed elevations showing traditional wood-frame construction with complex truss systems, load-bearing calculations marked in precise German script, specifications for materials that would require skilled carpentry and substantial lumber reserves. The plans were beautiful in their way, elegant solutions to structural problems that most engineers would admire. Moreland studied them for a long moment, then looked up with something that might have been amusement or might have been concern. "These are impressive," he said, and Eleanor translated smoothly, "but they present a problem. You're asking for materials we don't have in abundance and skills that would require pulling our most experienced carpenters off other critical projects. So I have a proposal." He glanced between Klaus and Tommy with the expression of a man who just decided to let his subordinates teach each other a lesson. "A competition. Hauptmann Werner, you and a crew of German volunteers will build one barracks using your designs. Corporal Ricci, you and your crew will erect a new Quonset hut. Same timeline, 1 week. We'll see which approach serves the camp's needs better." Klaus felt something ignite in his chest, a spark he hadn't felt since before his capture. Finally, an opportunity to demonstrate what German engineering could accomplish, to prove that precision and proper methodology would always triumph over American shortcuts and casual workmanship. He nodded sharply. Tommy, for his part, just shrugged with that infuriating American nonchalance, as if the outcome were already decided and he was simply going through motions to humor everyone involved. They began the next morning under a sky that promised snow but hadn't yet delivered. Klaus assembled his crew carefully, selecting men who'd worked in construction trades before the war. There was Ernst Köhler, the senior sergeant who moved with quiet authority and could read a level with barely a glance. There was a former roofer from Munich, a joiner from Hamburg, a mason from Cologne. They approached the work with German discipline, barely speaking as Klaus explained the plan, each man understanding his role in the larger system. They began by setting precise measurements, driving stakes into the frozen ground with geometric accuracy, ensuring that every angle was exact and every foundation point was level to within a millimeter. 50 meters away, Tommy's crew looked like chaos made manifest. Americans and Germans worked side by side, joking in broken mixtures of English and German. Someone's radio playing swing music that drifted across the worksite, laughter erupting periodically over some shared observation or minor mishap. They unloaded prefabricated Quonset sections from a truck, each piece stamped with numbers and assembly instructions, simple enough that Klaus suspected a child could follow them. No specialized skills required, no master craftsman needed, just bodies and willingness and the ability to follow basic directions. Klaus watched them between his own crew's careful timber cuts and felt something uncomfortable stirring in his gut. They were making progress. Not beautiful progress, not elegant progress, but undeniable forward momentum. The curved ribs of the Quonset hut began rising from the foundation with mechanical inevitability, each piece fitting into the next with the kind of foolproof design that eliminated the possibility of significant error. By the end of the first day, the basic structure was already taking shape while Klaus's crew was still ensuring their foundation was perfectly square. On the third day, Eleanor brought Klaus an envelope. He recognized the Red Cross insignia and his hands trembled as he opened it, but the news inside was the absence of news. Still no word on his wife, still no confirmation about his daughters, just the bureaucratic language of international agencies trying to trace millions of displaced persons across a shattered continent. Eleanor watched his face fall and sat down beside him on a stack of lumber, close enough that he could see she'd been crying recently, the redness around her eyes not quite concealed by powder. "My mother hasn't written since the Berlin raids," she said quietly in German, the professional distance dropping away to reveal someone equally suspended between hope and grief. "Every day I check the Red Cross lists. Every day there's nothing, and I don't know if that means she's alive and the mail system is simply destroyed, or if—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Klaus found himself talking about Stuttgart, about the bridge over the Neckar that had taken 3 years to design and build, about the way sunlight caught the suspension cables at dawn and made them glow like strings on some cosmic instrument. He described the mathematics involved, the complex calculations required to account for wind load and thermal expansion and the dynamic forces of traffic. He talked about it with pride because it was the last thing he'd created before the world fell apart, before everything he believed about German excellence and technical superiority became entangled with ash and genocide and defeat. Eleanor listened, then said something that stayed with Klaus long after she'd returned to her duties. "The Quonset hut was invented in 4 months. They've built 150,000 of them." She let that number settle between them like snow accumulating on frozen ground. 4 months from concept to mass production. 3 years for one bridge versus 4 months for a shelter system that's housing millions. That night, Klaus couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk listening to the breathing of 40 other men, the small sounds of restless dreams and suppressed coughs, and thought about those numbers. 150,000. The figure seemed impossible, yet he'd seen the evidence with his own eyes. these curved metal structures dotting American military installations from Kansas to the Pacific, each one housing dozens of men, each one erected in a day or two by whoever happened to be available. No master craftsman required, no 3-year development cycle. Just human need met with human ingenuity stripped down to its most democratic essence. By day 5, Klaus's barracks were beginning to look like something worth photographing. The frame stood elegant and true, the joints fitting together with the precision his training demanded, the proportions pleasing to an educated eye. Other prisoners stopped to admire it during their breaks. Even some American guards paused to nod with respect. Tommy's Quonset hut was already complete, squat, unremarkable, utterly without aesthetic charm. Klaus walked the perimeter of his own structure that evening, running his hands over the wood, feeling the satisfaction of work done properly, and allowed himself to believe that beauty and complexity would be vindicated. The telegram arrived on the afternoon of day 6, and Eleanor's hands shook as she brought it to Klaus at the worksite. He was standing inside the nearly complete barracks frame, calculating the final measurements for the roof supports, when he saw her expression and knew before she spoke that something had shifted in the universe. She handed him the yellow paper and he read it 3 times before the words became real. His youngest daughter, Anna, had been found in a refugee camp in Bavaria, alive, thin and traumatized but breathing and asking for her father. No word yet on his wife or his older daughter Maria, but one piece of his shattered family had been recovered from the wreckage of Europe. Klaus made a sound he didn't recognize, something between a laugh and a sob, and felt his legs give way. He sat down hard on the cold floor of his unfinished building and wept with the kind of abandon he hadn't permitted himself since childhood, since long before the Wehrmacht taught him that officers didn't crack, that German men mastered their emotions the way they mastered mathematics and engineering. Eleanor knelt beside him, her own tears flowing freely, and for several minutes they existed outside the boundaries of guard and prisoner, American and German, victor and defeated. They were simply 2 people suspended between grief and hope, each carrying the weight of family members who might be alive or dead, each understanding that this war had made orphans and widows of millions regardless of which flag they served. Ernst found them there and quietly organized the crew to give Klaus privacy. Word spread through the camp with the speed that good news always travels in places where hope is rationed more carefully than food. That evening, Moreland authorized a small celebration in Klaus's barracks. Someone produced a harmonica. Someone else had saved chocolate from a Red Cross package. The atmosphere softened in ways Klaus hadn't thought possible within the barbed wire perimeter of a prisoner of war camp. Men who'd been enemies months ago shared cigarettes and stories about their own children, their own families scattered across a continent that would take years to reassemble. Tommy approached Klaus with 2 tin cups of coffee. The real stuff, not the ersatz grain mixture the prisoners usually received. He sat down on the bunk beside Klaus without asking permission, in that American way that assumed equality rather than waiting for hierarchy to be established. "My sister had a baby last month," he said. "I got the letter 2 weeks ago. A boy. She named him Anthony after my grandfather. I've never met him. Don't know when I will." He paused, staring into his coffee. "But knowing he exists, knowing there's this little guy out there who's part of my family, it changes something. Makes the world feel less like it's ending." Klaus nodded, understanding more from Tommy's tone than from the English words he only partly grasped. They sat in companionable silence while around them the small celebration continued, and Klaus felt something he'd been protecting himself against for months, the dangerous luxury of hope, the possibility that survival might lead to something resembling life rather than just continued breathing. He spent the next morning sketching plans for a small chapel, working out the proportions during breaks from the barracks construction. Not for any particular faith, but as a gift to the camp, something beautiful to offer hope in a place defined by confinement and loss. He imagined a simple structure with clean lines and good light, a space where men of any religion or none could sit quietly with their thoughts. He showed the drawings to Ernst, who studied them with the careful attention of someone who understood that his commanding officer was investing hope in architecture, trying to build purpose from loss. The storm arrived that night with the kind of violence that only the Great Plains can produce. Wind screaming across flat land with nothing to slow it. Temperatures dropping so fast that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Klaus woke to the sound of metal groaning and wood cracking, sounds that shouldn't exist in a properly constructed building. He pulled on his coat and boots and stumbled outside into wind that tried to knock him flat. Snow so thick it was like moving through a white wall. Other prisoners emerged from their barracks, confused and alarmed, trying to understand what was happening through the chaos. Klaus fought his way toward his barracks, his beautiful creation, and felt his heart stop. The complex truss system he'd designed to distribute loads efficiently couldn't handle the lateral wind forces of a prairie storm. The elegant joints he'd been so proud of were splitting under stress they'd never been calculated to bear. As he watched, helpless, the entire structure collapsed inward with a sound like bones breaking, walls folding into the center, roof beams snapping like kindling. 3 days of careful work destroyed in less than 3 minutes. He stood there as the storm raged around him, staring at the wreckage, and something inside him broke more completely than the building had. This wasn't just a failed construction project. This was the visible proof of everything he'd been refusing to see, the physical manifestation of his own obsolete certainty. His education, his training, his entire professional identity, all of it had produced something that couldn't survive one night of reality. The Quonset hut stood 50 meters away, completely undamaged. Snow had drifted against its curved sides and slid off harmlessly. The wind that had shattered Klaus's building flowed over and around the semicircular design like water around a stone. Inside that ugly tin can, Tommy's crew had slept through the storm, warm and safe and utterly unaware that they'd just won an argument about the nature of engineering that Klaus hadn't even known he was having. Tommy appeared beside him at dawn, surveying the destruction. Klaus waited for mockery, for the vindication that any reasonable winner would feel watching their opponent's complete failure. But Tommy's face showed something worse than triumph. It showed pity. He put a hand on Klaus's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt like condemnation, and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The ruins spoke eloquently enough. Klaus walked back to his barracks, moving like a man decades older than his 38 years. He lay down on his bunk, turned his face to the wall, and refused to speak when Ernst checked on him. He refused the midday meal. He refused to acknowledge the other prisoners who tried to offer consolation. Because this wasn't about losing a competition. This was about realizing that everything he'd built his identity upon, German technical superiority, the value of complexity, the primacy of formal education, had been as fragile as those broken walls scattered across the frozen ground. Eleanor came to Klaus on the 3rd day of his silence, carrying a technical manual and a letter that had arrived that morning from her mother in Germany. She sat on the edge of his bunk without asking permission, a breach of protocol she'd never committed before, and spoke in low German that only he could understand. She told him that her mother had been found alive in Berlin, hiding in a simple root cellar while the elegant 4-story house her grandfather had built burned to the ground above her. The beautiful home, with its carved staircases and imported tile and architectural details that had taken craftsmen 2 years to complete, had become her mother's funeral pyre, except she'd survived by crawling into the ugly hole in the ground that the family had always been slightly embarrassed to mention. "The ugly hole in the ground saved me," her mother had written, "not the beautiful house." Eleanor placed the letter on Klaus's chest and left the technical manual beside his pillow. It was a U.S. Navy publication on Quonset hut design and deployment, pages worn from use, diagrams marked with notes in English. Klaus lay there for an hour after she left, staring at the curved metal ceiling above him, listening to the sounds of other prisoners going about their daily routines before finally picking up the manual and beginning to read. The prose was plain, almost brutally simple, written for sailors and construction battalions rather than trained engineers. But as Klaus worked through the specifications, something began to shift in his understanding. The Quonset hut had been designed by the U.S. Navy Seabees in 1941 at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The name itself was borrowed from the location, not some Grand architectural theory. The corrugated steel arches resisted wind through geometric form rather than complex engineering calculations. The semicircular shape was based on principles the Romans had understood 2,000 years ago. The arch distributes loads evenly, requiring no internal supports. Stable through mathematics, so fundamental they predated modern structural analysis. Klaus read that 8 unskilled men could erect a Quonset hut in one day, that each structure could be transported in a single truck, that the cost was 1/10 of traditional construction, that every piece was designed for replacement, meaning no single craftsman became irreplaceable, no specialized knowledge created bottlenecks in production. The manual included deployment statistics that made Klaus's hands tremble. Over 150,000 Quonset huts had been manufactured since 1941. They were housing troops in Alaska and Australia, serving as hospitals in North Africa and the Pacific, functioning as storage facilities and workshops and temporary headquarters across every theater of war. This wasn't inferior engineering. This was engineering for a completely different purpose than anything Klaus had been taught to value. It wasn't designed to showcase the engineer's brilliance or the builder's mastery. It was designed to shelter the maximum number of people with the minimum barriers to construction. It was democratic in a way Klaus was only beginning to understand. Democratic not as a political system, but as a design philosophy. Anyone could build it. Everyone could maintain it. The knowledge required wasn't locked behind years of university education and apprenticeship. It was accessible to farmers and clerks and soldiers and anyone else who could follow basic instructions. Klaus closed the manual and lay in the darkness of the barracks, feeling the weight of his entire professional education pressing down on him like water pressing on a man who'd gone too deep. He'd been trained at the Technical University of Stuttgart, one of the finest engineering schools in Europe, in a tradition that stretched back centuries through German academic excellence. He'd learned to calculate stress loads to 3 decimal places, to design structures that would stand for generations, to create buildings that would testify to the skill of their creators. Every professor had reinforced the same message, that German engineering represented the pinnacle of human technical achievement, that complexity was sophistication, that true quality required mastery accessible only to a dedicated few. But what if that entire tradition had been asking the wrong question? What if the goal wasn't to create monuments to engineering excellence, but to serve human need as efficiently as possible? What if simplicity wasn't a failure of imagination, but the highest form of achievement? Klaus got out of bed on the 4th day and found Tommy repairing a fence near the perimeter. He approached slowly, aware that his 3 days of silence had created a gulf that would require effort to cross. His English was halting and imperfect, but he forced the words out anyway. "I must learn. Will you teach me?" Tommy looked up from his work, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something warmer. He set down his tools and nodded, and they walked together to the Quonset hut that had survived the storm. For the next several hours, Tommy explained the construction process in simple English while Klaus took notes in German, creating a bilingual manual of understanding. They examined how the curved ribs fit together, how the simplicity eliminated weak points, how the shape itself was the solution rather than requiring elaborate support systems. Ray Cho joined them after lunch, bringing coffee and his own insights about improvisation with limited materials, lessons learned in an internment camp where making something from nothing had been necessary for survival. Klaus began to see the Quonset hut through new eyes. The arch was ancient Roman wisdom, not modern innovation, proof that the best solutions sometimes came from looking backward rather than forward. The simplicity wasn't laziness, but sophistication. Every unnecessary element had been stripped away until only the essential remained. It was designed for the user to assemble rather than the expert to control, which meant it embodied a kind of trust in human capability that Klaus's entire education had taught him to question. Every piece could be replaced, making the structure immortal even as its components were temporary. No single craftsman was irreplaceable, which meant the building served human need rather than human ego. Klaus felt something cracking open inside him, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. In Germany, he said slowly, choosing his English words with care. We designed buildings that needed German engineers to build. You designed buildings that needed only human beings. He paused, struggling to articulate what he was only beginning to understand. This is not inferior engineering. This is superior philosophy. Tommy smiled, not with triumph, but with recognition, as if he'd been waiting for Klaus to arrive at this understanding all along. They stood together in the cold Kansas afternoon, no longer guard and prisoner, but something more complicated and more hopeful. Two men learning to see each other's wisdom, building a bridge across the ruins of certainty. 2 weeks after the storm, Lieutenant Colonel Moreland called Klaus into his office with a request that carried the weight of opportunity disguised as duty. The county had approved a temporary civilian refugee center 5 miles from Camp Concordia, a facility to house displaced European families awaiting resettlement or reunification. The Red Cross estimated 50 to 70 people initially, with numbers likely to grow as more refugees arrived from processing centers on the coasts. Moreland needed shelter designs that could be erected quickly with limited skilled labor, structures that could accommodate families rather than military personnel, buildings that balanced dignity with economy. He asked Klaus directly because the German engineer had proven himself capable of both technical excellence and, more recently, the wisdom to recognize when simpler solutions served better than complex ones. Klaus requested 2 days to develop his proposal. He spent those days in careful study, reviewing the Quonset specifications with Tommy and Ray, sketching modifications that would adapt the basic design for civilian family use. He proposed internal curtain systems that could create privacy partitions within the curved space, allowing families to maintain some separation even in communal housing. He designed simple wood stove installations that would provide both heating and cooking capability. He calculated ventilation requirements and recommended small windows that could be cut into the metal walls to provide natural light without compromising structural integrity. Every modification honored the core simplicity of the original design while addressing the specific needs of displaced civilians who'd already lost everything except the hope of rebuilding. On the third day, Moreland convened a meeting that included not just Klaus and Tommy, but also Eleanor, Ernst, several American officers, and a delegation of senior German NCOs who represented different barracks in the camp. Klaus stood before them with his drawings spread across a table, his heart hammering against his ribs, aware that what he was about to say would either validate his transformation or reveal it as performance, as survival strategy rather than genuine change. He began in English, speaking slowly to ensure clarity, then repeated key points in German for the benefit of those whose English was limited. I propose we build the refugee center using Quonset hut designs, he said, and paused to let that statement settle. Modified for family privacy and civilian needs, but maintaining the core structure. He could feel the confusion in the room, the unspoken question that several men were too polite to voice. Why would a German engineer who'd spent his career designing complex structures advocate for the simplest possible solution? Klaus answered the question before anyone asked it. Because I could never design this, he said, his voice shaking slightly. None of us could. Not because we lacked technical skill, but because we were trained to solve the wrong problems. He gestured to his drawings, to the elegant modifications he'd made to a fundamentally simple design. German engineering education taught us to create monuments to expertise. Complex, expensive, requiring specialized knowledge. The Quonset hut is the opposite. It's a monument to human need. Simple enough that farmers, clerks, teachers, anyone can build it. Ernst was nodding slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. Several of the German NCOs shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty to their training and recognition of an uncomfortable truth. Klaus pressed forward, knowing he had to complete this admission while courage held. This is not inferior engineering, he said. This is superior philosophy. You designed for dignity, not dominance, for speed, not showcase, for the many, not the few. He looked directly at Tommy, then at Moreland, then back to his fellow Germans. We can learn from this. We must learn from this. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. Then Moreland stood and extended his hand to Klaus, not as commander to prisoner, but as one professional to another. "Let's build it," he said simply, and the tension in the room released like a held breath finally exhaled. Construction began the following week with Klaus and Tommy supervising mixed crews of American guards and German prisoners. The work had a different quality than the competition had carried, a sense of shared purpose that transcended the barbed wire perimeter of the camp. Ray showed the crews his improvisation techniques for working with limited materials. Ernst organized the German workers with his quiet efficiency, ensuring tasks were distributed fairly and completed thoroughly. Eleanor coordinated with the Red Cross to ensure the structures would meet civilian housing standards and arranged for basic furnishings, cots, blankets, cooking supplies to be delivered before the first families arrived. Klaus found himself working alongside men he'd have considered beneath his professional notice 6 months earlier, learning from their practical wisdom, discovering that the gap between theoretical knowledge and applied skill wasn't a hierarchy, but a partnership. Tommy taught him how to read wood grain to predict where boards would split, how to judge the quality of a cut by sound rather than just measurement, how to improvise solutions when specifications met reality's limitations. In return, Klaus shared his understanding of load distribution and stress analysis, helping Tommy see why certain joints worked better than others, why some designs failed under conditions that seemed similar to successful applications. The first family arrived 3 weeks after construction began. Klaus watched from a distance as a truck pulled up to the completed refugee center, saw a woman in a threadbare coat step down holding a small child, saw her face as she took in the curved metal buildings that would serve as temporary home. She didn't see elegant architecture or sophisticated engineering. She saw shelter. She saw warmth. She saw hope made tangible through simple curved walls and a roof that wouldn't leak. 2 days later, Eleanor brought Klaus news that stopped his heart for the second time in a month. His eldest daughter, Maria, had been found through Red Cross channels. She was thin and traumatized, suffering from pneumonia contracted during weeks of living rough, but she was alive and receiving medical care in Munich. And she'd asked about her father, wanted to know if he'd survived the war, wanted to come to America if that's where he was. Still no word on Klaus's wife, but now 2 of his 3 missing family members had been recovered from the chaos of Europe's collapse. Eleanor arranged for Maria to be transferred to the refugee center as soon as she was medically stable for travel. The journey would take weeks, perhaps months given the state of European transportation infrastructure. But she would come. Klaus would see his daughter again, and she would arrive at a place he'd helped build, sheltered by the kind of humble structure he'd once dismissed as inadequate, protected by the democratic philosophy he was only beginning to understand.